we we have the opportunity to learn more about this class. Classical is a DPP-4 inhibitors. We knew about the incretin-based therapy, but we learned a lot and we continue to learn about the DPP-4 inhibitors after the incretin-based therapy was introduced. Likewise, the SGLT2 inhibitor, the introduction and their performance has forced us to learn a lot about the physiology of the kidneys, which otherwise we would have left it to the nephrologist. See, normally in all our CMEs, if you look at it, no, we focus more on general diabetology, the pathophysiology, etc., the molecules, the guidelines, the incretin effect, the glucagon. So we make a passing mention about tentative effort at sharing some knowledge about the complications. For example, clinical patterns of proteinuria, or the discordance between retinopathy and nephropathy, something like that. But we never go deep into the details of these complications. We leave it to the specialists. But now it is incumbent on the part of the clinicians like us to appreciate more about the nuances of especially the complications of diabetes. That is number one. Second thing, what I thought was, I'm sure we have always discussed in the department, Professor Sundram is there, Professor Madhavan is there, we have always discussed among ourselves and also in our DGC meetings that there is always a discordance between retinopathy and nephropathy. Now, previously we used to believe that when somebody has got proteinuria or nephropathy, and if the retina is not involved, we always think that is probably a non-diabetic renal disease. Now we have learned a lot. You can have non-proteinuric diabetic kidney disease, proteinuric diabetic kidney disease, very accelerated diabetic kidney disease, etc. That is the second aspect. Third important aspect, which I thought was, when you look at retinopathy, I mean, we know the pathology, what's happening, the loss of pericytes, closure of the capillaries, capillary leak, anoxia or hypoxemia, neovessel formation, rupture, vitreous hemorrhage. In other words, everything has been focused on hypoxia. The retinal hypoxia is the kingpin which drives the diabetic retinopathy. Whereas in nephropathy, our understanding is retinopathy is the sine qua non of diabetic complications. It is driven majority by the hyperglycemia, whereas nephropathy, it's a complicated issue, especially in type 2DM. You have the participation of various factors. You talk about the hemodynamic factors initially, the increased GFR, the tubuloglomerular feedback, the basement membrane thickening, the podocytes fuse with each other, loss of podocytes. So in other words, and the mesangial expansion which chokes the capillaries. In other words, while hypoxia is the kingpin in the pathology of retinopathy, the way we have understood nephropathy, we have been taught and we have been learning and then sharing this with our friends and the students and junior colleagues is, it is a combination of the basement membrane thickening, the loss of podocytes, the initially the what shall we say, the charge selective theory. In other words, the hemodynamic forces, the shearing forces, the charge selectivity of the glomerular basement membrane, the filtration barrier, and the mesangial expansion which is choking the pelvis. So we have not so far talked about renal hypoxia in the context of diabetic kidney disease. Have we? In this context, this paper is interesting. So we have talked about the retinal hypoxia. We have talked about the pathophysiology of diabetic kidney disease to a limited extent that we have understood the renal physiology and pathology. And we have been always harping on these 4 or 5 factors. This paper was interesting me because the SGLT2 inhibitors has given an opportunity for people like us to understand, has given an opportunity for researchers to look at the various animal experiments and then propound an hypothesis, and the renal hypoxia has been identified as a factor of significance in diabetic kidney disease. Now, this is paradoxical because 20 to 25% of the cardiac output goes to the kidneys. So, a tissue which receives so much of the cardiac output, it is really, what shall we say, it's paradoxical to think that how it can have hypoxemia. Yes, I think that is the crux of today's presentation. This is a very, very difficult paper. And once again, thanks Mohan for sharing that information. And thank Rajesh for accepting to present this paper. It's a very, very difficult paper, I tell you. I have read it about 3 or 4 times. Still, I'm sure there are a lot of points. I'm sure Rajesh should have done it 4 or 5 times. Professor Sundaram said he read it about 2 or 3 times. It's a difficult paper, but it has got a lot of messages and a very convincing message. And probably not only the SGLT2 inhibitors, the future will see probably the introduction of many molecules which attempt at correcting the disparity between the oxygen requirement or the effort put by the renal tissue and what is available as a substrate, etc., etc. Now over to you, Rajesh. I just thought I'll give this brief introduction so that we appreciate the difference in the pathophysiology of the diabetic retinopathy and the kidney disease. And this review, this excellent review on the basics, is an attempt to understand the difference in greater detail and appreciate the role of renal hypoxia. Yes, Rajesh.
So good evening, sir.
Good evening.
So respected senior clinicians and my dear friends, before I want to start, I want to sincerely thank and profusely thank our Professor Venkatraman sir for giving me this article. Sir, can you see the slides, sir?
Yeah, we are able to see, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Rajesh, make it full.
Presentation mode.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So as rightly said by Professor Venkatraman sir, this is an interesting paper. So this review article actually deals about the role of renal hypoxia and the pathogenesis of diabetic kidney diseases and a promising target for a newer renoprotective agents like SGLT2 inhibitors. So going straightly into the article, we know that diabetic kidney disease is the leading cause of end-stage renal disease. And once the diabetic kidney disease sets in, what happens eventually, it progresses. And we are not able to find out an effective and a safe strategy to retard the progression of this disease. The reason is that the underlying mechanisms are actually complex and not completely understood. So that's the reason we are not able to devise a strategy to retard the progression. But in the recent years, there are a lot of evidences which now postulates that chronic hypoxia, maybe it is involved in the primary pathophysiological pathway that drives the diabetic kidney disease as well as chronic kidney disease of other etiologies, and this was called the chronic hypoxia hypothesis. We know hypoxia means there is a mismatch between the oxygen delivery as well as the oxygen demand, but in the renal context, oxygen delivery for the primary determinant of oxygen delivery is the renal perfusion, whereas the primary determinant of the oxygen demand is the active sodium reabsorption. Because for the active sodium reabsorption, there should be formation of ATP, and for this formation of ATP requires oxidative phosphorylation. So the primary determinant of oxygen demand is going to be this ATP formation, which is useful for the active sodium reabsorption. So this is what we need to understand. And what happens in diabetes is that there is a complete compromise of this oxygen balance in two ways. One side, it impairs the oxygen delivery owing to the hyperglycemia induced microvascular changes, and also it exacerbates the oxygen demand. Because there is, in diabetes, what happens, there is an overexpression of SGLT2, there is an upregulation of SGLT, and there is more amount of sodium which is reabsorbed. So because of the more amount of sodium is getting reabsorbed, the ATP production will be more and the oxygen demand will actually will be more, and there will also be glomerular hyperfiltration, which also leads to increased oxygen demand. So what happens is that this resultant hypoxia, it creates a vicious cycle of a capillary damage, inflammation, deposition of extracellular matrix, and ultimately fibrosis and nephron loss. So what happens is this review article actually highlights chronic hypoxia and the pathogenesis of DKD and its prospective as a promising therapeutic target. And it also outlines the cellular mechanism of hypoxia and also evidence for renal hypoxia in animal and as well as in human studies. And it also highlights the promise of newer imaging modalities, including the blood oxygen level dependent MRI. We call it as the BOLD MRI, and also interventions such as SGLT2 inhibitors that may protect the kidney from amelioration of this renal hypoglycemia. So we know that the kidneys are highly metabolically active organs. They consume the maximum amount of oxygen per tissue mass next to the heart. So for this excessive oxygen demand, there is an excessive oxygen delivery by abundant perfusion. But in spite of this excessive oxygen delivery, what happens? The kidneys are considerably susceptible to hypoxic injury. So take into account this acute kidney injury. So there are evidences to show that in acute kidney injury, oxygen deprivation is a key event, and this happens due to various causes. Could be due to ischemia, reperfusion, or sepsis, or exposure to nephrotoxins. Not only for acute kidney injury, even for chronic kidney disease, hypoxia plays an equally crucial role in the development of progression, and therefore it could be a potential target. It could represent a potential target where we can meddle with. The most common cause of CKD is diabetes, which accounts for about 45% of the cases of end-stage renal disease worldwide. And when you look at this renal tissue oxygen tension, it is a result of a delicate balance between oxygen delivery and oxygen demand. I already told you that the principal determinant of oxygen demand is formation of ATP, which is required for the tubular reabsorption of sodium. So what happens is that by the secondary active transport, several tubular transporters, including SGLT2 inhibitors, they use this sodium-potassium ATPase pump. We call it as the NKA pump, which is located at the basolateral membrane for transporting sodium along with water and other molecules. And for this, ATP production has to be there. And this ATP production, for the primary source of ATP production, you can see it is through oxidative phosphorylation. And the proximal tubules almost exclusively use this oxidative phosphorylation for ATP production under normal conditions. And the second part I told you, for the oxygen delivery, the primary determinant is actually the renal perfusion. See, in most of the tissues, just like a heart, whenever there is a demand in oxygen, that is actually compensated by an increase in the supply of oxygen. But that's not the case with kidney. It is not that very simple. It is a little more complex, because what happens in the kidney is that whenever there is an increase in the perfusion, it not only addresses the demand, but what happens is that there will be an increase in GFR. So when there is an increase in renal perfusion, it not only delivers extra oxygen, but it also increases the GFR. So if the GFR increases, what happens? More and more sodium will get filtered, and more sodium has to be reabsorbed. And when sodium has to be reabsorbed, then that requires more amount of ATP production. And because of that, there will be increased oxygen demand. So what happens in kidneys? Whenever there is an oxygen demand, when there is a compensatory increase of oxygen delivery, there will be further increase in the oxygen demand. So this is what we need to address, we need to understand. So therefore,
yeah, sorry, I think this paper, I thought I'll emphasize few points because it's a highly theoretical paper. No, this is the crux of the point. See, a tissue which has got so much of blood supply, which has got the capacity for an increased oxygen supply also, as demanded by increasing the GFR, ultimately what happens is a compensation could be detrimental to the system. So that is, I think, the kingpin of the whole thing, and that's where the SGLT2 targets. So we always know that, in fact, early 80s, 90s, when you had the model for nephropathy, stage 1 is nephromegaly, increased GFR. All of us have studied this. GFR 90 to 120, stage 1, nephromegaly. But why? Why it's happening? We accepted it. Now we know that, yes, it is happening because of this upregulation, and it is happening. This increased GFR is an adaptation to the increased absorption of sodium, and this is detrimental. How? That is coming to, so it is paradoxical, as I told you earlier, in spite of a rich blood supply, in spite of the capacity to enhance the oxygen demand and the ATP production, still this kidney suffers because it is not the GFR increase alone. We think that increase in the GFR will answer the problem. On the other hand, it is detrimental and counterproductive. This goes like a vicious cycle. I just thought I'll highlight this point because it's a absolutely important theoretical point. I hope you don't mind, Rajesh, for it.
Yes, sir. Please, sir. Please.
Yeah, that's all. I just wanted to, you nicely summed up the the difference in the tissues between, heart tissue as well as the kidney. This particular aspect is absolutely important for further discussion. Thank you, Rajesh.
Thank you, sir. So in the kidney context, so whenever there is an increased oxygen demand, merely an increased oxygen delivery alone is not sufficient to preserve the renal tissue oxygenation. Therefore, additional mechanisms are actually necessary to preserve the tissue oxygenation. And if you look into the blood supply of the renal cortex and renal medulla, they actually enjoy different levels of perfusion. 90% of the blood supply to the kidney is actually received by the cortex. In fact, if you take into consideration the cardiac output, 20 to 25% of the cardiac output is actually received by cortex. That means it has a very, very rich blood supply. And the amount of blood flows and oxygen delivery there actually exceeds the metabolic demand. So much of oxygen is delivered there, it actually exceeds the metabolic demand there, and this could be potentially dangerous because there will be excessive formation of reactive oxygen species that could be potentially harmful. So there are certain adaptive mechanisms to counter this, that is a diffusional shunting of oxygen. How it happens? Diffusional shunting of oxygen will happen from the preglomerular arteries to the postglomerular veins. So this will actually protect the kidney from the harmful effects of hyperoxia, so that the PO2 of the renal cortex will be maintained somewhere between 50 to 60. So this adaptive mechanism is diffusional shunting. So this helps to preserve the cortex from the harmful effects of hyperoxia. And there are again evidences to support this finding, because what happens is that it has been found that oxygen migrates through the renal vasculature faster than the red blood cells. So this has been evident from studies. In studies, it has been shown that the PO2 of the renal vein actually exceeds the PO2 of the efferent arterioles as well as the cortical nephron tissues. So, and again, this renal PO2 actually remains stable even when experimentally the blood flow to the cortex is altered within the physiological range, somewhere by around 30%. So this is possibly explained by a corresponding change in the oxygen shunting. So this shunting of oxygen, however, does confer the risk of hypoxic injury foremost in the medullary region. So the cortex becomes protected because of this shunting from hyperoxia. But because of this shunting, what happens? The medulla suffers the hypoxic injury. So this is what we need to keep in mind. Because the medulla actually receives only 10% of the cortical blood flow. And actually this is the main function of the medulla is to concentrate the urine. So it has to maintain a hypertonic interstitium. So the metabolic demand is actually very, very high in the medulla. So what happens is that the medullary tissue PO2 will actually be maintained in a range of between 10 to 20. That itself, there will be a hypoxic milieu which has been set inside. So to overcome this, there should be certain defense mechanisms for the medulla to overcome this hypoxia. For that, there will be relative insensitivity of the medulla will be relatively insensitive to the vasoactive substances like angiotensin II or endothelin and noradrenaline when compared with the cortex. So when compared with cortex, medulla is relatively insensitive to these vasoactive substances. Not only that, we also have adenosine. Adenosine have a distinct and an opposite effect on the cortex as well as the medullary blood flow. See, in the cortex, what it does, it brings about vasoconstriction and reduces the oxygen supply there. Whereas in the medulla, since there is hypoxia, it causes vasodilatation, so it increases the oxygen delivery to the medulla. So this is what we need to understand. And there is another protective mechanism, that is production of erythropoietin. The hypoxic stimuli will actually induce the production of erythropoietin. Thereby the hematocrit will get increased as well as the oxygen delivery capacity will also get increased. So these defensive mechanisms may not be sufficient. They may not be sufficient to counteract a progressive hypoxia. So when the hypoxia is short-lived, this is okay. When there is a progressive hypoxia, these defensive mechanisms may not be sufficient, because we need to understand there is one more thing which is happening. Because of the close arrangement of the descending and ascending vasorecta, oxygen shunting is thought to occur even in the medulla. So already there is hypoxia. The level of the PO2 is already less in the medulla. So in spite of that, if there is an additional oxygen shunting, then the hypoxia will further become aggravated, will further become intensified. So this is what we need to understand.
Your point, I think, if you go to the previous slide,
Yes, sir.
yeah, with respect to erythropoietin, see what has happened is from the animal studies, it has been suggested the erythropoietin producing cells are nothing but specialized fibroblasts, which are the corticomedullary junction. And the medulla is adapting in such a way, whenever there is hypoxemia or hypoxia, the erythropoietin level could be increased, and thereby I think it can compensate. But what happens in diabetes is, because of the increased demand of the tissues to absorb sodium, the functional status of the kidney tissues is changed in such a way this fibroblasts get converted into myofibroblasts. In other words, the cells that ought to have been producing erythropoietin do have a tendency to lack their original purpose. They get converted to myofibroblasts. But when you're going to address this by an SGLT2 inhibition that is preventing this unnecessary absorption, thereby conserving the energy, then you're able to retain the identity of the erythropoietin producing fibroblasts, so that this is one of the tentative or suggested mechanisms which appeals, as we have relearning the physiology of the renal tissue, how the SGLT2 can help. In other words, any other molecule which is going to preserve the identity of the erythropoietin producing fibroblast is going to help. So if you find out in the SGLT2 inhibitors in some of the mechanistic studies, there is no increase in the level of erythropoietin, maybe it's marginal, but the erythropoietin, which would ought to otherwise come down, probably is being prevented by this group of drugs. I just thought the importance of the erythropoietin, the medullary adaptation, there is a level of hypoxia to stimulate the erythropoietin mechanism, how it gets deranged in diabetes. Yes, Rajesh, please go ahead.
Yes, sir. So now let us look into this chronic hypoxic hypothesis of the diabetic kidney disease. We know it is the mismatch of the oxygen delivery and the oxygen demand that has been hypothesized to underlie the CKD of various etiologies. So what happens? What this hypothesis postulates is that the chronic hypoxia hypothesis, it says that if there is a glomerular disease, irrespective of the underlying pathoetiology, then there will be damage to the glomerular capillaries, which will lead to a restriction of the glomerular as well as the post-glomerular blood flow. Thus, there will be restriction in the oxygen delivery. And this will be carried out down also. So the downstream segments also, that is the medulla, also experience hypoxic injury, and there will be loss of a healthy tissue. So what happens for this, what will happen is that the remaining unaffected glomeruli will make up for that loss by increasing their single nephron GFR with increases in the oxygen consumption, as well as further reducing the local oxygen level. So consequently, these events predispose the kidney to a vicious cycle of hypoxic injury, nephron loss, and progressive nephropathy. So what happens in diabetes? Diabetes compromises the oxygen balance owing to several mechanisms that increase the ATP demand, and therefore at the same time they possibly decrease the ATP generation. So how is that happening? So what are the reasons for increased ATP demand? So I told you the biggest contributor for ATP consumption is the tubular sodium reabsorption. So in diabetes and hyperglycemia, what happens? There will be increased renal transport, that is increased renal sodium reabsorption will be there because of the tubular growth will be there, and because of this there will be upregulation of the SGLTs, and this upregulation of the SGLTs will mount to increased amount of reabsorption of the filtered glucose as well as the sodium. And again, there will be another thing, there will be an increase in the EGFR. So hyperfiltration will be there because of the physiology of the tubuloglomerular feedback mechanism. We know about this mechanism. So it is primarily mediated by the macula densa. Macula densa are the specialized cells which are situated in the distal part of the ascending limb of the loop of Henle. So what happens is that whenever it will actually sense the sodium delivery. So whenever the sodium delivery is less, what happens? It will send signal. It will sense us that there is a hypovolemia, or it will sense that there is dehydration. So it will alter the it will send signal to the juxtaglomerular apparatus, and renin will get secreted. So renin will have a differential tone on the afferent as well as the efferent arterioles. So what will happen when sodium delivery is actually reduced, EGFR actually increases. When sodium delivery increases, the the GFR actually reduces. So here there will be because of reduction in the sodium delivery to the macula densa, what happened? There will be a compensatory increase in the GFR. And there are also several studies which have shown that glomerular hyperfiltration in response to hyperglycemia is an early clinical entity of diabetes. Not only that, there will also be this RAS system which gets activated in diabetes. That also will amount to the sodium reabsorption, and there will also be elevated vasopressin levels. That also will contribute to the sodium reabsorption. So, taking all these diabetes-induced alterations into account, mathematical modeling of the rat nephrons have predicted an increase in the sodium transport by 50% and an increase in the oxygen demand, which is due to the sodium transport, by 100%. So the oxygen demand, that is the oxygen consumption, actually increases by 100% in diabetes. So this is what we need to understand.
Rajesh, can you go back to the previous slide? I just thought a couple of points. I hope you don't mind.
Yeah, please, sir. Please, sir.
Previous slide. Yeah. See, in diabetes, what happens is the single nephron EGFR. Now, this has been studied in a lot of non-diabetic renal diseases, especially glomerulonephritis. See, the difference between the glomerulonephritis and diabetic nephropathy is diabetic nephropathy is not an intrinsic glomerular disease. I mean, this is the fundamental, because intrinsic glomerular disease is characterized by certain, say, granular CAS or hyaline CAS. In fact, presence of CAS probably eliminates the possibility of diabetic nephropathy in the sense that it is not an intrinsic glomerular disease. In intrinsic glomerular disease, the glomeruli get lost. So they get closed. So the neighboring glomeruli have to increase the function. That is how the concept of the single nephron GFR being increased. And this is the Brenner's hypothesis. Brenner's hypothesis is when there is an intrinsic glomerular disease and the glomeruli are damaged, the surviving healthier glomeruli do more job by enhancing their filtration. And we know how this increased GFR to a single nephron can be counterproductive. That is number one. But how does it happen in diabetes? In diabetes, what happens is you have the mesangial expansion. See, the mesangium is a connective tissue between the glomeruli. When that expands, extracellular matrix that expands, because of excessive deposition or because of defective removal, it chokes the glomeruli. So even though it is not an intrinsic glomerular disease, by the collapse of the glomeruli because of the expanding mesangium, you create a situation wherein this concept of single nephron GFR works. That is how diabetic nephropathy is. The model is in such a way the glomerular closure and the responsive hypoxia. That is number one. Second is, I want to talk about the difference between the afferent and the efferent arteriole. Now, in medulla, I think the medullary tissue is not responsive to the vasoactive agents. The afferent and the efferent arteriole are. That is why whenever there is, for example, there is an increased RAS system, the efferent arteriole constricts, and that is how the RAS blockers come. You may turn around and ask, after all, there is a vasopressor. The efferent arteriole constricts. Why not the afferent arteriole? The afferent arteriole has got the capacity of the protective. They can secrete the vasodilated prostaglandins, so which keep them dilated. That is why the efferent arteriole constricts, and that is why we always say you give the RAS blockers first, address the efferent arteriole, and then talk about the tubuloglomerular modulation through the SGLT2 inhibitors. Yes, these two things I thought I'll share, which will be relevant in this context. Yes, Rajesh. Thank you.
Sir.
Thank you for tolerating me in between.
Sir. Yes. So now let us look into what are the reasons for decreased ATP generation. See, for ATP generation, we need an efficient substrate. So efficient substrate utilization is required. So in animal data, it has been found that kidneys are unable to compensate this increased ATP production because of the effects of diabetes on the fuel generation. What happens? Diabetes is associated with the insulin resistance, and this insulin resistance shifts the renal fuel utilization away from glucose, glutamine, and citrate towards the free fatty acid oxidation because of increased delivery of free fatty acids and activation of the free fatty acid metabolism. But what should we remember is that this free fatty acids are less energy efficient when compared with the glucose, and they yield a lower ATP per oxygen molecule consumed. So the insulin resistance and also results in impaired ability to synthesize ATP by inhibition of the AMPK and mitochondrial dysfunction and reduced electrolyte transport efficiency. So in conclusion, the net effect of the increased ATP demand as well as the decreased ATP generation is an ATP deficit and the increased renal consumption of the oxygen. So the demand will get increased, so that will not be compensated. And there will also be reduction in the oxygen delivery. This is because of the hyperglycemia induced damage to the microvasculature. So all these things make the diabetes disease states makes the kidneys more susceptible to self-reinforcing process of hypoxia tissue damage. So this is how it happens. So what happens in diabetes? There will be increased ATP demand because there will be hyperfiltration, there will be increased tubular growth, there will be increased SGLT upregulation, RAS activation will be there, increased vasopressin level will be there. And on the other side, instead of an increased generation, there will be the ATP generation will actually get decreased. This is because of the increased microvascular damage leading to diminished renal perfusion and oxygen supply. And there will be reduced oxygen efficient fuel utilization because it comes from the energy is utilized from the free fatty acids, and there will be increased AMPK inhibition and increased mitochondrial dysfunction. So because of this, the increased ATP will not be, the demand will not be met. So the oxygen demand will actually get increased, so hypoxia will actually set in. So now let us look into the molecular mechanisms of hypoxia. So if you histologically examine the chronic diseased kidneys, irrespective of the primary etiology, it shows characteristic changes that are suggestive of a chronic tissue hypoxia. There are certain common pathological findings which include a loss of glomerular as well as peritubular macrovasculature, as well as presence of tubulointerstitial fibrosis and accumulation of the extracellular matrix and inflammatory cell infiltration. And there are other experimental studies which shows that hypoxia has a role in inducing fibrosis in the renal tissue. There are a series of experiments which was done by Norman and colleagues, which was done in vitro, where they induced hypoxia in human renal cells. Only 1%, PO2 was kept at 1%. And what they found was that in response to this, there was an increase in the extracellular matrix, that is collagen production, and decrease in the extracellular matrix turnover. So all these things promoted fibrogenesis. And to counter this, we need some defensive mechanism, and for that we have this hypoxia inducible factor, HIF family. So this is, that means what will this HIF do is that it will target hundreds of genes that are important for counteraction to hypoxia and tissue adaptation. And not only that, activation of this HIF will increase the oxygen supply by promoting angiogenesis. By promoting angiogenesis through increased VEGF expression and by upregulation of the EPO production. So what will happen when there is HIF activation, the oxygen supply will also get increased, but at the same time, oxygen demand also will get reduced. Within few minutes, this will occur, and within minutes, what happens? It induces metabolic suppression of the ATP consuming processes like the protein formation. So both way it helps. So HIV activation increases the oxygen supply. At the same time, it decreases the oxygen demand, and also it shifts the aerobic ATP production because the ATP is produced by oxidative phosphorylation. So it consumes a lot of oxygen. So it shifts the aerobic ATP production to anaerobic ATP production by glycolysis. This is termed as the Pasteur effect. And it also brings about reduction in the mitochondrial leak respiration, which is there as a reaction to the oxidative stress. So by all these processes, what happens? The HIF activation further conserves the oxygen use. So not only that, it not only increases the oxygen supply and decreases the oxygen demand, it not only does that, it also plays an important role in repairment of the cellular damage by recruitment of inflammatory cells and induction of matrix synthesis. But what we need to remember here, what we need to understand here is that the renoprotective role of this HIF is controversial, and it is mainly limited to your acute kidney injury. In acute kidney injury, the insult is short-lived, so the HIF activation takes place for a short period and it gives all the beneficial effects. But when this HIF activation becomes, when this HIF becomes permanently activated, then that actually becomes detrimental, because chronic HIF activation, instead of doing good, it does harm, because it increases inflammation, it brings about pathological extracellular matrix accumulation, and there will be progressive fibrosis, and all characteristics of hypoxia and possible contributors to permanent damage will be there. So, several excellent reviews have actually outlined this contradictory observation. So, future research is merited to obtain a deeper understanding of HIF and its potential, whether it is really going to be beneficial, or on a longer run, if it is permanently activated, this is really going to be detrimental or not. Future research has to give a clear answer.
I think in this context, Rajesh, if you can talk
Yes,
about
sir.
the chronic HIF. Now, in diabetic nephropathy, more and more in diabetic kidney disease, we are recognizing an entity of non-proteinuric diabetic kidney disease, which probably has got an accelerated or slightly less accelerated course of action. And sometimes you do not have the classical stages. One of the theories hypothesized is recurrent episodes of acute kidney injury probably tilts the balance so that you do not have the conventional pattern of microproteinuria, macroproteinuria, reduction in EGFR. Without much of a proteinuria itself, you can have a patient in CKD3A. Probably mechanisms like this are operative. Now, if you understand this hypoxia and chronic HIF activation, so you could visualize a subset of patients who we have seen in day-to-day practice. Type 2 patients, not the common garden variety, but an occasional, but a subset of patients who do not have proteinuria, but we go on to CKD and you do the biopsy, it is nothing but diabetic nephropathy. Yeah.
So now let us look into some evidence from the animal studies. So various research techniques have found that there was cellular hypoxia as well as tissue hypoxia in the animal models of the diabetic kidney disease. There was one study which was conducted in 1994 where they induced type 1 diabetes by streptozotocin, and they found that it led to an increase in the cellular oxygen demand in the renal tubules, and there was also an increase in the, simultaneously there was an increase in the tubular sodium transport. So tubular sodium reabsorption was also increased, and then when they gave something called Oobane, it actually blocks the NK pump, so sodium cannot be reabsorbed. When they gave this particular substance, what they found was that there was abolition of this increased demand. So the demand actually came down. So this is what they found in one particular animal rat study. And again, there was another study where they induced, they measured with, in this study, they measured it with microelectrodes, where they induced diabetes, and they found that there was a diffuse hypoxia was there in the entire renal parenchyma, but predominantly it was there in the medullary region. So there, it was also confirmed an increase in the tubular oxygen consumption. And there was another study, there was another study where they actually induced diabetes, and they found that there was a decrease in the renal PO2 and increase in the renal oxygen consumption after the induction of diabetes. This was due to the glomerular hyperfiltration and oxygen loss through the mitochondrial leak respiration because of the oxidative stress. And again, there are other studies. There is another study which showed that intrarenal hypoxia actually preceded the development of albuminuria, which indicates that the hypoxia has a crucial role even in the initiation of diabetic kidney disease. So there are so many other studies where they used different immunohistochemical staining. So they further to look into the distribution and extent of hypoxia tissue. So one such staining is the HIF staining. In HIF staining, they were able to visualize the hypoxic response of regions with limited oxygenation. And there is another staining called pimonidazole adduct staining, where they could identify the cells that is experiencing the severe hypoxia, because this particular substance, pimonidazole, actually binds to tissues which have a where the PO2 is actually less than 10. So in these studies, what they have done, in the studies where they used HIF staining and pimonidazole adduct staining, what they found was that the hypoxia was shown to be present as early as 7 days after the diabetes induction. And both these studies have shown that the hypoxia actually intensified during the first 30 days after the induction, and this was more marked in the medulla region. And but more interestingly, the staining was no longer present at 90 days after diabetes induction. So hypoxia was there. Hypoxia was picked up at the 7 days itself, as early as 7 days itself. It progressed in the first 30 days, but after 90 days, what happened? The staining did not pick up hypoxia, which is actually explained by declining tubular transport activity after prolonged diabetes duration. Because the tubular activity is actually declined, the requirement for the ATP production actually gets reduced. So the oxygen requirement or the oxygen demand actually gets reduced. Thereby, there is some amount of offset in the hypoxia. So probably that is the reason the staining was not there. It did not pick up after the 90-day period. And for better understanding of the short and long-term hypoxia in vivo, in both animals and humans, it is essential to develop some non-invasive measurement, that is method for oxygen metabolism. In this regard, there is something called as the blood oxygen level dependent magnetic resonance imaging, that is the BOLD MRI. So this is of considerable value here, and it is a non-invasive method. BOLD MRI is a non-invasive method. Here, it measures the deoxyhemoglobin as an endogenous contrast agent. So you need not give any exogenous contrast agent. So it measures the deoxyhemoglobin levels, and the outcome of this measure is actually expressed as a relaxation rate, that is R2. So whenever the tissue oxygenation is actually less, that is wherever there is hypoxia, R2 level should actually increase. So this is about the BOLD MRI, and it has been used to study early stages of kidney disease in several rat models of diabetic nephropathy. There was one study which showed a decrease in the renal PO2 just 2 days after the induction of diabetes, and it aggravated over the course of 28 days. And so this was evident in a BOLD MRI study. And there was another study where after inducing diabetes, what they found was that they used this BOLD MRI and they measured the PO2 of cortex and 3 different medullary regions. What they found was that in the BOLD MRI, the finding was that intrarenal oxygenation was lower in all the 4 regions. That means hypoxia was there in all the 4 regions, but the hypoxia was more pronounced in the outer strip of the outer medulla, that this is the region which corresponds to the highest metabolic burden. So in conclusion, various animal studies have been done, and various types of measurement techniques like the various staining techniques are also done. And all these things point out that there is a role for tissue hypoxia for induction of this diabetic kidney disease. And again, there are other animal studies to show hypoxia actually plays a role in the etiology of other non-diabetes related CKDs also. But what we need to remember is that there are differences between the renal physiology of the murines as well as humans. So many reasons are there. So whatever we obtain from the animal studies, we cannot exactly extrapolate it to the human studies. We need proper human studies for that. And in this context, if we look into the human studies, the same BOLD MRI was actually first applied in 1990s. And initial studies, they focused only on the medulla because this is the region which is known to have the highest ischemic injury. So because the hypoxia is more pronounced in the medullary region, so this was the major site they usually studied. And they used certain maneuvers, like a widely used maneuver was application of furosemide. So when furosemide was applied, what will happen? The sodium and chloride reabsorption will actually get inhibited, so that the oxygen demand, that is the requirement for ATP production, actually comes down. So the oxygen demand actually comes down. And again, because of increase in the GFR, what will happen? There will be increased oxygenation also. So this is one maneuver. They apply furosemide and then they study it. And this will allow for estimation of the oxygen demand actually. So initially what happened, this human bold MRI studies had conflicting results. Maybe lack of standardization of the confounding factors like water consumption or use of low field strength. So many reasons were there. But however, as the technology progressed, what happened? There were several studies. Now it indicates that renal function is related to the renal oxygenation. So when there is a decline in renal function, probably hypoxia was the cause. So many studies have established this. There was one study which was demonstrated in patients with CKD. It showed that high cortical R2 values, people who had CKD with high cortical R2 values. High cortical R2 values means they will be having hypoxia at the cortex level. If both the things were there, CKD with cortical hypoxia, what they found, 3 times they were more likely to develop an adverse renal outcome. And there were various other studies which showed that cortical oxygenation independently predicts the progression to CKD by annual eGFR loss. And there was another study where they combined arterial spin labeling with this bold MRI measurement in patients who had diabetes with stage 3 CKD. And interestingly, what they found was that the cortical oxygenation in patients with mild to moderate CKD was reduced, but this reduction was not statistically significant. So there was hypoxia at the cortex level, but it was not statistically significant. But simultaneously, what they found was also the cortical blood flow was actually reduced. So the cortical blood flow was grossly reduced. To that reduction, the hypoxia was not that very prominent. And again, the blood flow to the other regions also, that is the lower regions also, was actually reduced. And that actually, by a furosemide response, they found that there was a faster deterioration of the renal function in these subjects. So again, in diabetic kidney disease, this bold MRI measurements have shown that there is a lower oxygen level, that is the hypoxia is there in the renal cortex in patients with the diabetic kidney disease when compared with people who are all healthy controls. Paradoxically, although the cortical PO2 declined with the progression of nephropathy, medullary hypoxia did not elevate. See, as the nephropathy progresses, what happens? There will be increased hypoxia, but in the cortex level, this hypoxia actually progressed, still worsened. But in the medullary level, this hypoxia was actually elevated. So there are reasons for it, probably deterioration of the tubular function. Because of the deterioration of tubular function, the oxygen requirement actually will come down. And because of the reduced oxygen demand, probably the hypoxia was not more pronounced in the medullary region. So bold MRI has given us so many data. It has shown very clearly that hypoxia has been postulated in the pathogenesis of the diabetic kidney disease and any other chronic kidney disease, but it has certain limitations. One common finding in all the studies of CKD to date is that the cortical R2 is only minimally increased in control in compared to controls. That is, the cortical hypoxia was not that much pronounced. So cortical R2 was only minimally increased, but the cortical perfusion substantially got reduced. See, when the perfusion gets reduced, what happens? The actually hypoxia should worsen, but there was only minimal cortical hypoxia. So what was the reason for this anomalous finding? It is not exactly clear whether this anomalous finding of a small increase in the cortical R2 in CKD is a reflection of oxygenation being conserved in CKD because of a compensatory reduction in the oxygen demand, or it is purely a limitation of this bold MRI. We do not know. That is not very clear. And again, there is another important limitation. The R2 value is actually determined by the deoxyhemoglobin content, which in turn is dependent on the hematocrit and fractional blood volume and oxygen saturation. So any differences, any alterations in this hematocrit and fractional blood volume and oxygen saturation will actually alter the R2. What happens in CKD? In CKD, the hematocrit, the hemoglobin level, all these things will be actually low. So the R2 level will actually be low. But on the other hand, there will be hypoxia also in the renal tissues. So the R2 should actually increase. So there will not be a proper increase in the R2 because of the other reasons like the problems with the hematocrit or the fractional blood volume. For this, what we require is a direct estimation of oxygen saturation of hemoglobin and an additional measurement of the fractional blood volume. All these things are not that very easy. So overall, what we can say now is that currently Bold MRI is more suitable in evaluating the acute changes in intrarenal oxygen availability by physiological or pharmacological maneuver. So you do some maneuver and you look into what is the response for it rather than comparing the relative oxygen status between the kidneys. So now there is a study which is going on with the Bold MRI where they're evaluating the acute and chronic inhibition of SGLT2 inhibitors on the renal oxygenation. Now let us move into interventions with renal hypoxia. Now we know that hypoxia is the cause, is an important factor which actually initiates a DKD or any other chronic kidney disease. Now, whether any strategies which can alter this hypoxia can give some benefit or not, that is what they looked into it. In this, a promising agent is the SGLT2 inhibitors. This SGLT2 transporters, they are actually present in the apical brush border of the proximal tubule, and they actively reabsorb the glucose together with the sodium. So this is what we know, but this SGLT2 is responsible for the maximal glucose reabsorption as well as sodium reabsorption in the early PCT. So 97% of the glucose reabsorption is actually done by SGLT2, whereas the remaining 3% is actually reabsorbed in the late proximal tubule by the SGLT1. And again, SGLT2 inhibition not only lowers the blood glucose level, we know that there are some systemic pleiotropic effects. BP gets reduced, body weight gets reduced, and there is also alterations in the uric acid levels. We all know that. But there is also long-term CVOT trials with all the available glyphosins, EMPIRE outcome trial, CANMAS, DECLARE TIMI. All these things have shown that SGLT2 improved the renal outcomes also, including reduction in ESRD. And there is a specific trial for renal patients. That is, they involved patients with diabetic kidney disease. In the CREDENCE trial, they gave canagliflozin, and what they found was that there is a relative risk reduction in the development of end-stage renal disease by 32%. But although all these trials show a promising effect of SGLT2 inhibitors in reducing the renal endpoints, but the actual mechanism by which they are giving this beneficial effects are yet to be determined. And purely the glucose lowering effect and the small pleiotropic effect alone cannot account for such a huge renal protective effect. So remarkably, what happens is that with the SGLT2 inhibition, there will be an acute decline in the GFR, which is actually reversible after the drug discontinuation, and which is consistent with a functional GFR decline due to increased delivery of sodium to the macula densa. So what will happen when there is increased delivery of sodium to delivery to the macula densa? Because of the TGF mechanism, the actually GFR will get actually reduced. But it could be also secondary due to an increment in the proximal tubule hydrostatic pressure after a decrease in the reabsorption of sodium and therefore water uptake. So this reduction in GFR will actually result in reduced tubular workload, will in turn amount to a reduced oxygen consumption. So the oxygen demand will actually get reduced by an SGLT2 inhibition. So it has a potential to improve the tissue oxygenation, thereby it can have a favorable role in retarding the progression of the CKD. So current evidence of the effects of the SGLT2 inhibition on renal hypoxia.
Sir, this concept is not clear, sir.
Yes, sir.
Rajesh, sir, can you explain again, sir, this concept?
The last.
See, what happens is when we give SGLT2 inhibition, when we give SGLT2 inhibitors, what will happen? There will be an acute decline in the GFR because there will be hyperfiltration will be, glomerular hyperfiltration will be there. So that will get addressed. There will be decline in the GFR, and this decline in the GFR can be due to two reasons. One is because of the sodium reabsorption. What will happen? Less amount of sodium only will reach the macula densa. So what will happen? There will be further reduction in the in the GFR, or it could be secondary to an increment in the proximal tubular hydrostatic pressure because of the reduction in the, because of the decrease in the reabsorption of the sodium and water uptake. So altogether what happens? The GFR actually declines when we start an SGLT2 inhibitor. Because the GFR reduces, the tubular workload actually reduces. When the tubular workload reduces, what will happen? The oxygen requirement, that is the oxygen consumption, actually reduces. So in this way, what will happen? SGLT2 inhibition brings about a reduction in the oxygen demand.
Okay, but how does it differ between an acute and chronic disease, sir?
Rajesh and Gauri, what I have understood is, in all the studies, whether it is empiric outcome exploratory or your credence, which is dedicated, there is a dip. The EGFR comes down. See, if you start with around 57 in the EGFR, baseline EGFR, it comes to about 53 or 52, then it starts rising. Now, this can happen even with RAS blockers. Anything that interferes with the hemodynamics, there will be a temporary declining or a worsening. That's what he says. Now, once you withdraw the drug, see, whatever has been happening, once you give an SGLT2 inhibitor, once you inhibit the absorption of glucose, the extra sodium in the filtrate will be sensed by the macula densa. So the afferent artery undergoes vascular alteration, the tone, constriction. This results in EGFR reduction, which can be within the acceptable limits. Supposing the EGFR comes down, say from around say 75 to around 50 or 60, it's a case of acute kidney injury wherein you have to stop the medication. So there have been instances, but fortunately not much, that you need to stop the medication. I think this functional aspect is in the context of an acute decline in the GFR, wherein you withdraw the medication and then the resulting process reduces the workload on the tubules, and then there is a recovery of the renal function as well. That's how I've understood this particular description.
Sir, one small.
Venkatraman, normally what we say is that the acute reduction in GFR is a very temporary phenomenon, days to maybe a week or two. Then it goes up. Whereas this article says that only with the removal of the drug, withdrawal of the drug will result in.
No, what they have done is, this is all the explanatory explanations for what could happen if there is an acute kidney injury, what could happen if you withdraw the drug. Now, with the SGLT2 inhibitors, to the best of my knowledge, there is no, what shall we say, the endpoints. For example, when you give a RAS blocker, you anticipate a 25% reduction in the creatine clearance. So the serum potassium can go up by 25%. The creatine can go up. For example, within 2 weeks you do, after you start somebody on the ACE inhibitor or ARB, if you do, most of us do not do that. The creatinine can go up by 0.5. I mean, the potassium, the creatine can go up by 0.2 or 0.3. If you start with 0.9, it can go up to 1.2. That is anticipated. But instead of from 0.9 to 1.2, if it is going to be 1.6 creatinine, then you know that from CKD2, it has come to CKD3 or so. It's a huge drop in the EGFR, wherein probably you need to stop the medication. Such a guideline, to the best of my knowledge, has not been in there. It has left to the clinician's discretion. Whereas the nephrologists have taught us that when you do an ACE inhibitor or ARB, there could be a similar situation, but it could be very, very less. But it can happen because of this.
No, but the question is, once the acute drop in EGFR is corrected, even with the continuation of the drug, GFR starts going up. Are we going to lose the whatever benefit we get from SGLT inhibitor? That is what we have to surmise.
No.
Sir,
no,
another
what happened in
doubt, sir.
If you look at what happens in credence trial,
Yeah, there is
there
increase
was
in
reduction,
EGFR.
but the maximal benefit was in the EGFR of 30 to 45. In fact,
Correct,
what
correct.
was more than 60, EGFR more than 60, the benefit was in the CKD3A, 45 to 60, and maximal benefit was in CKD3A, 3B, sorry, 30
No,
to
what-
45.
No, my
So,
question.
this decline in the EGFR, if it becomes pathological, but when does it become pathological? To the best of my knowledge, the criteria are not established. Maybe you have to use your clinical discretion and then think about stopping the SGLT2, which in my opinion has not happened so far, but might happen with huge number of patients being candidates for SGLT2 in future. So we should know. So for example, as I gave the example, if the creatinine drops from 0.9, if it comes to 1.1, you accept it, 0.2 milligram per person. But if it is going to be 1.5 or 1.6, almost doubling of serum creatinine, then you know there is an acute kidney injury, you stop the medication. So this can happen in practice. For example, I have had a patient, the GLP receptor agonist, he vomited. He was in borderline. See, from a creatinine of 1.1, it came to 2.2. We have to withdraw. But that amount of kidney injury was persisting. He never got back. He never recovered. In other words, in clinical scenarios, whether it is with intervention or probably any insult to the kidneys, the kidney can compensate only to a particular extent. Actually, you have seen the defensive mechanisms. But fortunately, in clinical practice, this scenario doesn't happen frequently. That's what I have understood from
Sir,
yeah.
Sir, I have one particular doubt, sir. Actually, what happens in Credence or in DAPA CKD, the initial decline in GFR is only for 3 weeks, sir. Because they have seen the GFR in 3 weeks.
No,
After that, the GFR improves, sir.
No, Gauri, you go through the Credence data. What happens is, if you look at the category of the EGFR, then the EGFR, when it is more than 60, it takes almost 1 year and 3 months, 15 months for the effects to be benefited. Whereas the effect is seen, that is from the downslope, that is the EGFR comes down, comes to the basal level and then improves. This pattern is seen at about 9 months with respect to EGFR of 30 to 45. In other words, the reduction in EGFR, returning to the baseline, and then the improvement, it takes somewhere between 9 months to 15 months, the various categories of EGFR. If you look at the exploratory analysis of the Credence population, starting with the baseline of EGFR of 57.
Okay, sir. I will get back after this. No, I read it yesterday, sir, because we will discuss later, sir.
Yeah, no, the Credence post hoc data is there in the website. You can go there, wherein the categories, 3 categories are, that is for 60, more than 60, 45 to 60, 30 to 45. The maximum benefit, the earlier benefit is seen in 30 to 45, but that also it takes about 9 months.
Okay, sir. Okay, I didn't note that point, sir.
Please verify that and then get back to me.
Sir, sure, sir. I will do that, sir, tonight itself, sir. Sure, sir. Thanks, sir.
In fact, they have taken, I think, 15 ml or 10 ml as the situation where they require dialysis or renal transplant, and they said it takes longer compared to placebo. 1.5 years compared to 3.5 years, something 4.5 years.
So normally, if you start with the Credence, the average age is 63. You will reach the stage from EGFR of 57, which is the baseline EGFR in Credence, to reach a value of 10. It takes about
15 years.
Now, if you give canagliflozin, you postpone by 15 years.
15 years.
That is, it takes about 25 years. That's a huge purchase. 15 years, you postpone the advantage. Theoretically, it's extrapolated from what has been observed from the Credence data. Yes, Rajesh, too much of interruption. Please go ahead.
No, sir.
I think we had a very, very good discussion. I think thanks Gauri and Madhu for that.
Sir, in early CKD, actually, there will be glomerular hyperfiltration, no, sir?
Yes.
Pardon?
Because of the glomerular hyperfiltration, there will be more amount of sodium which will get reabsorbed, sir.
Yeah.
Because of the increased sodium reabsorption, what will happen? That the oxygen consumption will actually get increased, and sir, there will be a hypoxia will be there, no, sir?
Yeah.
So in early CKD, in very early CKD, when we use an SGLT2 inhibitor, this EGFR will actually come down. So in that way,
no, Actually, what happens is when you have increased absorption of sodium,
Yes.
this is what happens in the early stages by the upregulation of the SGLT2.
Yes.
This makes it obligatory on the part of the renal tissue to spend more energy.
Yes.
To spend more energy, you have to produce more ATP.
Yes, sir.
That is
Yes.
how the relative hypoxia comes.
Correct.
That is why by blocking the SGLT2, and then what you are going to do is you are going to allow that amount of sodium in the filtrate, which is sensitive
Correct.
by the bacteria densa,
Correct.
and afferent arteriole undergoes constriction. Because
Correct.
this alteration of the tone, which is nothing but constriction.
Correct.
This constriction results in a transient dip in the EGFR because you have manipulated the hemodynamics. Because you know that if it is going to be an increased EGFR, which can happen with the other scenario, then it is more of a workload for the kidneys. That is how. So even though we talk about the interference of the proximal tubular absorption, which has been upregulated in the type 2 diabetes mellitus, what exactly happens with the SGLT2 with respect to it is a functional status. The kidney tissue, which would have otherwise spent much more energy, and in the process, what happens? The kidney tissue is lost. There is mesangium, there is fibrosis, there is loss of renal tissue, etc., etc. This is being interfered by the SGLT2, but in an occasional patient, this intervention can be counterproductive. That is how this the EGFR, when it declines, acute decline, if it is beyond the acceptable limits, then it can produce a permanent AKI and that is acute kidney injury on top of CKD, which can be detrimental. But in clinical scenario, what are the parameters to decide this? I think it is so far, to the best of my knowledge, it has not been shared by the industry. I think we should use our clinical discretion. But in my experience, all of us have been using SGLT2 very extensively. Such a situation has not occurred, to the best of my knowledge.
The article says that it is in a way a conversion to beneficial way of ATP formation. I don't know whether there is a parallel between what happens in myocardium. Because myocardium also, we say that the myocardial tissue switches over to a beneficial way of energy production. Whether we can compare that to this, I don't know.
Yeah, no, here I think the SGLT2, I think there is some other molecules which are going to produce favorably with respect to metabolism and ATP production. With respect to ATP, I would like to draw your attention here. What was called as, I think, the Randall effect. If you forget the kidney tissue, if you have a malignancy, a rapidly dividing sarcoma, what happens is from glucose, you go up to pyruvate. Because of lack of oxygen, the mitochondrial metabolism or aerobic glycolysis is interfered. That's what is happening here also. So what happened? Why I talked about the parallel is the similar thing can happen in a sarcoma, in a rapidly dividing sarcoma. So a lot of pyruvate gets accumulated, and in the scenario of anaerobic environment, the pyruvate gets converted to lactate, and lactate gets converted back to glucose. This is the reverse Randall effect, wherein for each molecule of glucose that is produced, you spend more energy. That is one of the reasons for the cachexia of malignancy. Maybe an occasional patient with CKD, we have seen the cachexia, besides giving allowance for the malnutrition, inability to consume the nutrients, you see out of proportion cachexia in some cases of CKD. This could be operative because there is a defective metabolic shift. The aerobic metabolism cannot be taken care of as an extrapolation of the worsening of the hypoxemia, which I am telling you, which is probably more relevant in the context of an acute kidney injury rather than chronic. Yes, any comment or anything, Madhu, you'd like to?
I think, okay, we'll maybe at the end. Okay.
So now let us look into the current evidence of effects of SGLT2 inhibition on renal hypoxia. Using the mathematical model, Lennon et al. Predicted the effect of SGLT2 inhibition on the oxygen consumption of the various segments of the renal tubule. What he found was that a reduction in the EGFR was actually associated with a concomitant reduction in the cortical oxygen consumption by 30%. So when EGFR reduces, at least 30% of the oxygen demand is actually reduced. And it also brought about a shift in the tubular glucose and sodium load and transport work downstream to the segments in the outer medulla including the late proximal tubule where SGLT1 will take care of that, will compensate for that SGLT2 blockade, as well as the thick ascending limbs of the loop of Henle. So as a consequence of this shift, what happens? The outer medullary PO2 is expected to be reduced by the SGLT2 inhibition. Although the reduction in the EGFR, also the reduction in the GFR actually attenuates such an effect. So by lowering the medullary PO2, SGLT2 inhibition may render the outer medullary zone more vulnerable to hypoxia and injury. So it is already vulnerable. The SGLT2 inhibitor, in a part, it can protect the cortex, but it makes the medulla more vulnerable to hypoxia and injury. So in contrast, but what can happen here is that the transport shift can mimic a systemic hypoxia, can induce a HIF signaling in the cortex and outer medulla, which can enhance the expression of protective genes, and it can stimulate the EPO release. So by this counter-regulatory mechanism, so it can somewhat counter that hypoxia. Thus, SGLT2 inhibition may be a double-edged sword with regard to medullary oxygenation, and it is not yet unknown whether the final outcome of this medullary hypoxia is going to be adverse or it could be benefit to the overall kidney function because of the counter-regulatory counter-responses. And
I think the first sentence should read as in contrast to modeling. The English is wrong. In contrast to modeling studies.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
No, in the next slide, Rajesh.
Sir, my slide is not moving, sir. Just a minute, sir.
No, the first sentence I was just making a language correction. It is in contrast to modeling studies, not in correspondence. It is wrong language.
You have come to the next slide, Rajesh.
Sir, it is not moving, sir. Just a minute.
No,
Sir.
it has moved. You have come to the next slide.
Yeah, it has moved.
I am seeing only the previous slide, sir.
No, I'll read it for you. In correspondence to in contrast to the modeling studies, non-selective SGLT2 inhibition and selective SGLT2 inhibition in animal models of type 1 diabetes have indeed shown to be improving the renal oxygenation, primarily the cortical region.
Sir, no, it has come now, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's a time lag. I think
so
happening is, see, lot of experimental models this author has taken. See, not necessarily all these things are in concordance with the way we have understood and the background information that we have had. There are some discordant results as well. And I think he's a nephrologist. He's predicting that could be other end of the, other aspect of SGLT2 inhibition, which could be counterproductive. But so far we have not had, Yes, Rajesh.
Yes, sir. In one study, it has been shown that SGLT2 inhibition by fluorescein led to a rapid dissipation of the hyperfiltration, a reduction in the NK activity and sodium reabsorption, and normalization of the oxygen demand of the renal tubular cells. And a rat model of type 1 diabetes recently extended these results and showed SGLT inhibition to reduce the glomerular filtration and reverse the cortical hypoxia. And it also showed that sodium reabsorption was shifted from the proximal tubule to the distal segments of the nephron at the cost of deterioration of the medullary tissue oxygenation. But it is not clear whether this medullary hypoxia is unbeneficial or could contribute to preserve the renal function owing to the secondary effects of the HIF activation and EPO formation. And again, in another study, SGLT2 inhibition showed that it reduced the GFR and concomitantly normalized the tricarboxylic acid cycle activity, which in turn will reduce the oxygen demand. So in addition to SGLT2 inhibition led to a less tricarboxylic acid metabolite accumulation and less oxidative stress and a decrease in albuminuria, although no effect is there on the tubulointestinal inflammation was observed. And there was another study which demonstrated that treatment with SGLT2 inhibition attenuated the diabetes-induced upregulation of the profibrotic genes in diabetic mice, although urinary markers of tubular damage exhibited no change. So lastly, in another study, SGLT2 inhibition observed a decrease in HIF1 expression in the proximal tubular cells, which suggests that there is an elevation of tissue hypoxia. Because the tissue hypoxia got elevated, then there is a decrease in the HA1 expression. Together with there is a decrease in the tubular injury and interstitial fibronectin. So, supplementation of SGLT2 inhibition to human renal tubulointestinal cells that are exposed to hypoxia inhibits the HIF1 alpha, the HIF1A expression and the expression of specific target genes that contribute to tissue fibrosis. To summarize, what we can say is that when we use SGLT2 inhibition, when we use an SGLT2 inhibitor, what happens is that the cortex is actually preserved from the effects of hypoxia, but actually the medullary hypoxia can get worsened. We need future studies in humans to show whether SGLT2 inhibition really proves to be favorable in giving in long term it is going to be retard the progression of chronic kidney disease or not. So we need studies to show what impact it has on the medullary hypoxia. And again, going to other interventions, being a chronic disease, we can look into the lifestyle interventions. One such lifestyle intervention is the sodium handling. So whether a reduced sodium diet is going to have an impact here or not, there were some studies. In one particular studies, hypertensive young adults and normotensive young adults were actually asked to adhere to a 1 week low sodium diet as well as a 1 week high sodium diet. And what they found was that low sodium diet did not improve the cortical oxygenation, but it significantly brought a benefit in the medullary oxygenation. So low sodium diet increased the medullary oxygenation in subjects who had normotension as well as who had hypertension. And but in contrast, there was one animal model of type 1 diabetes where they gave this low sodium diet, but what happened that in turn it increased the GFR, possibly because of the activation of the TGF mechanism as a result of low filtered sodium concentration called the sodium paradox. So it can do the other way also, which we have to keep in mind. So the added value of a low sodium diet on renal oxygenation and oxygen consumption is actually it is actually a question, especially in people with type 2 diabetes, whether it is really useful or not, it's really a big question. And again, slide is not moving, sir. Just a minute, sir. Yes. Sir, can you see the slide, sir?
Yeah, we are able to see.
Yeah. So, on the other hand, if you are going to give agents that actually increase the ATP production, at the same time they reduce the ATP exhaustion, so that will be actually a promising agent. So here for lowering the renal ATP consumption, you have agents like vasopressin receptor blockers and dual SGLT1 and 2 inhibitors. And to improve the ATP generation, you have mitochondrial peptides, and bioavailable small molecule activators of AMP, PK, and mammalian target of rapamycin complex 1 inhibitors, or even the GLP-1 receptor analogs. And even small enhancement in fuel utilization may translate into a large improvement in renal function and ultimately clinical outcomes, although the data are limited. And
this is with respect to HIF system.
It's not moving, sir.
Please go ahead.
Other molecules which are in the pipeline.
Yes. Sorry, sir, I'm having some issues. So what happens? In addition to preventing this hypoxia, so if we adapt the hypoxia, adaptability is another promising target. So here you have some agent called as propyl hydroxylase inhibitors. They are novel drugs which are designed to increase the EPO production by increasing the expression of HIF2A under normoxic conditions. So one agent is there, propyl hydroxylase inhibitor, and 2 recent phase 3 trials have shown it to be beneficial effect on the beneficial effect of Roxa to start on the hemoglobin levels in patients with CKD with and without dialysis treatment. And data suggests that erythropoietin has direct renoprotective effects beyond improving hematocrit and oxygen carrying capacity. For example, erythropoietin has been shown to prevent podocyte injury, improve endothelial function, and attenuate albuminuria. However, chronic HIF1 stabilization may lead to ongoing inflammation. And again, the safety profile of this is actually, there is an ongoing trial which is yet to come. And there is another investigational agent that is to regulate the antioxidant defense, which is aimed at giving a nuclear factor erythroid factor. So nuclear factor erythroid factor 2 is a transcriptional factor that controls the expression of several antioxidants that detoxify and eliminate the reactive oxygen species. One such agent is your tolvaptan. So what they have found is this tolvaptan can upregulate this nuclear factor erythroid factor 2 oxidant pathway, and subsequently it can reduce proteinuria and improve the renal function in mice. And you also have another agent here, bardoxolone. They have found that it has improved the renal function in 24-week and 52-week studies in patients with CKD. But again, there is another follow-up study which showed that patients landed in heart failure, especially patients who are having a higher basal BNP, and in patients who all had a prior hospitalization for heart failure. In those subjects, using bardoxolone actually worsened the heart failure. So that also we have to keep in mind. So these are two agents, that is tolvaptan and bardoxolone. But there are many other agents that have been actually investigated, like N-acetylcysteine, coenzyme Q10, and vitamin E. And furthermore, an integrated approach by patient-tailored micronutrient therapy with antioxidant properties might have the ability to mitigate this oxidative damage. So to conclude, what they have found is that hypoxia was found to be detrimental. For hypoxia is known to cause and worsen the DKD, and hypoxia, chronic hypoxia, actually leads to a vicious cycle of inflammation, fibrosis, and nephron loss, ultimately resulting in a state of progressive DKD. And human research on this renal hypoxia has been scarce because of the lack of non-invasive technologies. But with the development of this bold MRI to measure the tissue oxygenation, possibly combined with the positron emission tomography tracers that can assess the oxygen demand, there is now a promising modality to further examine the hypoxia-related pathophysiological mechanisms. And assuming hypoxia is a major culprit in the pathogenesis of DKD, then targeting the underlying risk factors early in the course of the disease holds promise as a major therapeutic avenue for the treatment and prevention of DKD. And ideally, therapeutic strategies should attenuate both inappropriate renal energy expenditure as well as to improve the substrate metabolism to normalize the renal oxygen demand, as well as to optimize the renal oxygen delivery. And SGLT2 inhibitors have received considerable attention because of the observed clinical benefits and might modulate several factors related to the oxygen homeostasis. Therefore, further studies addressing the underlying mechanism of SGLT2 inhibition and other compounds in the development will be critical to delineate their therapeutic promise. Thank you, sir.
Rajesh, fantastic. I'm sure you should have gone through this article 4 or 5 times. I think
Thank you, sir.
We have had an interesting discussion, maybe a comment or two from others because I have talked a lot. Just to sum up, I think this has been the first review which has been focusing on renal hypoxia as the kingpin with respect to the initiation and the progression of nephropathy. Of course, other components we have seen, the increased EGFR, the mesangial expansion, the basement membrane thickening, the podocyte structural damage, fusion of the podocytes, etc., etc. And of course, lastly with the decline. These are all the pathophysiological entities which we have appreciated already. Probably the starting point could be a renal hypoxia. We have, I think, we had an excellent review. One of the best reviews which I thought all of us should, be familiar with, because the future is going to probably revolve around this, because this is a paradigm shift with respect to our understanding of the diabetic nephropathy. So far, we have been focusing on the hemodynamics, the shearing force, the charge selectivity, basement membrane, mesangium, etc. All this probably are because of the hypoxia. Because when you talk about the myocardium, it is easier to understand how the myocardium can have hypoxemia. Whereas when you talk about the kidney tissue, you know, the kidney and liver have got so much of a blood supply. How can they have hypoxemia? I think this is a really awakening. It has sensitized us to a new concept. Unfortunately, molecules are available. I'm sure there should be some comments from other friends who have connected this evening. Yes, please go ahead before you wind up. I know it's already late, about 1.5 hours, but it was an interesting and a lengthy paper. Yes.
Yes, I have only one question. We initially the target was always in reducing the amount of creatinine excretion, in decreasing this thing. But now we know that creatinine excretion does not. I mean, sorry, the albumin excretion does not directly correlate at all with their the thing. So, is it because of this hypoxia which is not being addressed by the by ACE-ARB, why we are not getting that plus point, sir?
Yeah. See how far proteinuria contributes to the pathophysiology of diabetic nephropathy is questionable. In the early stages, it's only a marker. Whatever is happening. Down the line, probably a migration or a lot of explosion of proteins into the interstitium can probably damage the tubules and then add another contributory factor. Otherwise, proteinuria is a marker for nephropathy, and proteinuria per se, it just gives you the index of the severity and not by itself contribute, excepting when you have loss into the interstitium probably of macroproteins, which could be detrimental to the renal tissue.
It's a very exciting concept, I agree. But most of the data that we have today is from animal experiments, except for Bold MRI. I think even Bold MRI, we do not know when we are going to use it as a day-to-day clinical practice. But it's a very exciting concept. But we may be too premature to say that hypoxia, Dr. Morgan, hypoxia is the only reason for.
No.
I think it's a very complex issue. In fact, unless you have very good knowledge about the physiological functioning of kidney, I think it's very difficult to understand this article.
Absolutely, you are perfectly right. It's very, very complicated. That's why it took 1.5 hours. And then really, congratulate Rajesh. He should have spent so much of effort. Any other comments?
Sir, Dr. Murthy used to tell, you are altering the physiology, thereby, see, we are inhibiting the SGLT2 inhibitors, thereby we derive all these benefits. But still, I don't know, as Dr. Madhavan was telling, I don't know what will be the, whether really this will be a good idea of renal hypoxia is the only thing, or is there anything else? Like Madhavan was telling.
How I see is, when the body adapts and compensates without producing a pathology, there you don't interfere. That is why in the last issue we talked about whether you should treat pre-diabetes. Pre-diabetes, in my opinion, is an adaptive mechanism in some aspects. Whereas when you have diabetic nephropathy, when you have retinopathy, when you have a cardiac disease, these are all pathological entities. Prior to that, there would have been some adaptations. At that point of time, probably interference might be detrimental. But having seen that adaptation has gone to a stage wherein it is detrimental, that's what is happening in the renal tissue. See, what starts as an adaptation, for example, the increased GFR is an adaptation. But what starts as an adaptation becomes detrimental to the tissue and to the health of the human being, then it becomes a disease. So, physiology, then there is a tendency for a disease to develop wherein you have physiological adaptation, and then when this adaptation becomes counterproductive, it becomes pathology, a disease. I think at that stage we need to interfere. That's my understanding of the physiology and the pathology.
Thank you.
And the intervening segment as well. Yes, Lakshmi, yes.
Sir, does systemic hypertension translate into intraglomerular hypertension? Should we be, how much is hypertension?
Certainly. See, that is why I said, of course, even retinopathy, compared to retinopathy, nephropathy is a different scenario because you have hyperglycemia, hypertension, dyslipidemia, the changes, etc., other factors contributing. Certainly, hypertension also contributes to the worsening of the nephropathy or even in the initiation. So that is why you focus so much on hypertension, and especially after a particular stage, hypertension is much more probably significant than control of hyperglycemia. So far, that's what I said. See, so far we have been focusing on, identifying and controlling the various factors, hyperglycemia, hypertension, uric acid, to mention a few. Now, you're talking about a different, it's a paradigm shift. As Madhavan said, Not the final word has been said, but certainly we have got an understanding. Yes, everything points down to probably something to do with the functional status of the renal tissue. The kidney is overworking. In the process of overworking, it is producing certain amount of substrate deficiency, certain amount of hypoxemia, and that needs to be addressed. And that is what the SGLT2 are doing. I think in that way, this is a really an eye-opener for us. Not the final word has been said, as Madhu rightly pointed out, but it just makes us think a lot. Is it not? Very interesting paper. If there are no more questions or comments, sir, Professor Sundaram or anybody, Dhanmitriyan, I think we can have a comment. I want to listen to you before we close another 2 minutes because the IPL match is started. Nothing. No,
Dana, you are muted.
Unmute.
Dana, you are muted.
You have to unmute yourself, Dhanmitri. Yeah.
It's an excellent paper for an excellent discussion on an excellent Sunday evening, sir. Thank you. For
So
that,
thank you so much.
wonderful.
Thank you so much. Any other comments? Otherwise, we can close. So I thank once again. I hope you appreciate this idea of this monthly spotlight, wherein we take a very, very highly academic paper and then try to discuss so that we have a better understanding, we improve upon our academics. And I thank you all for your participation. And just to remind you, on October 11th, I think we have planned a CME. I think almost all of you are involved. I'm sure Raghupati and team will share the agenda. And thank you all for being speakers as well as the chairpersons for that meeting. Of course, it is going to be a CME with some of the contemporary topics, which I have identified, which I hope the audience will find it useful. And with your, with the knowledge of my team, the speakers and the chairpersons, it will add credibility and a lot of values to this session. So see you all on October 11th. By I think 5 o'clock we will start so that we finish by 7:30 and we finish before the IPL starts. Thank you. And once again, thank the micro team, Raghupati, Gokul, and of course, Jawar Babu is always the center man behind all the organizations. And Nagaraj is not there in the screen. Thank the Micro Lab for the opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Yes, excellent.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, brilliant.
Excellent talk, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Raghupati, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Gokul, sir. Thank you, sir. Sir.